The photograph that changed everything isn't dramatic. There is no cathedral, no train spreading across marble, no dynasty on display. There is a woman walking out of a wooden chapel in candlelight, wearing something that grazes the floor like water. Pearl-colored silk crepe, bias cut, draped at the collarbone, open at the back. No beading, no lace, no volume. And when it was over, when Carolyn Bessette and John F. Kennedy Jr. had exchanged vows on September 21, 1996, in the First African Baptist Church on Cumberland Island, Georgia, before roughly 40 people, only one photograph was selected to give the world. Carolyn made the choice herself. When their photographer Dennis Reggie asked which image to release, her answer was immediate: show the dress. Her friend had designed it, not the groom, not the kiss, the dress. That instruction is the whole story, but to understand why it matters, why a piece of fabric cut on the bias from pearl white silk crepe became one of the most documented wedding gowns in American history, you have to understand who Carolyn Bessette was before she walked into the most photographed marriage in the country. She was born January 7, 1966, in White Plains, New York, the youngest of 3 children, raised in Old Greenwich, Connecticut, after her parents divorced and her mother remarried a surgeon named Richard Freeman. She attended St. Mary's High School, where her classmates voted her the ultimate beautiful person. She attended Boston University's School of Education and graduated in January 1988 with a degree in elementary education. A friend would later say she loved children, but hated getting up early. So she didn't teach. She sold clothes. Her first job after college was at the Calvin Klein boutique at Chestnut Hill Mall in Newton, Massachusetts. A saleswoman. She was noticed almost immediately. Susan Sokol, then president of Calvin Klein, was looking for someone to handle the brand's high-profile celebrity clients in New York: Annette Bening, Diane Sawyer, and Bessette was recommended for the position. She was absolutely charming. She was completely refreshing. She was completely outgoing, Sokol told the New York Times. Bessette transferred to the Manhattan flagship showroom and began climbing. By the time she left Calvin Klein in spring 1996, she had moved from celebrity sales to director of PR to director of show productions, overseeing runway shows, earning a salary in the low 6 figures. One former colleague described it more precisely. Carolyn Bessette basically ran the department. This is the context that almost always gets missed. The woman who would become famous for her wedding dress was, before the wedding, one of the people at Calvin Klein responsible for deciding how things looked. She understood restraint as brand strategy. She understood that what you leave out communicates as powerfully as what you include. She had spent years inside the machine reinventing American minimalism, working alongside a designer who was, in the words of her friend Narciso Rodriguez, reinventing things, creating an energy of design and style that showed in the clothes. One interview survives from this period, a 1992 Glamour magazine piece. Asked about her personal style, Bessette described it as a white shirt, blue jeans. That was the whole answer. You can read that as simplicity. You can also read it as a woman who had already thought very hard about what she wanted to say and chose an understatement precisely because she understood the alternative. She gave only 2 recorded soundbites publicly across her entire life. She never sat for a magazine interview or photo shoot after marrying John Kennedy. What she had, instead, was a trained eye and a professional understanding of image as argument. Rodriguez, who met her during his own Calvin Klein tenure and lived in the same apartment building, moving in almost by accident, a real estate tip arriving just as he needed one, put it the clearest way in a 2025 Elle interview. Her style was never a production. It was just something innate. There's a meaningful distinction in that sentence. A production can be staged. What's innate resists management. But what the 3 years that followed the wedding would show, over and over, was that what felt innate to Carolyn was constantly being managed by forces that had no interest in letting her be innate. Before any of that, though, there was John. John F. Kennedy, Jr. was the son of the assassinated 35th President of the United States. He was born in November 1960, weeks after his father was elected. He had been photographed under the Resolute desk as a toddler. He had saluted his father's coffin at age 3, in an image that would never fully leave the public consciousness. By the time he was in his late 20s, People magazine had named him Sexiest Man Alive. He was described as being thoroughly amused by the title, and by most accounts, he loved the attention. But the difference between loving attention as a man and absorbing its weight as a husband would matter enormously. One psychobiographical study described him as among the most photographed men in the world. Another source stated it more directly. Being the focus of the media was second nature to John. The implication, left unstated, was that it wasn't second nature to anyone else, including the woman he was about to marry. To understand what Carolyn was walking into, you need to feel the template that preceded her. Jackie Kennedy Onassis had set the terms for what a Kennedy woman looked like, how she moved through public life, what she absorbed and what she performed. Academic historians describe Jackie as the woman who hit all the cues expected of a Kennedy wife, performing public elegance, subordinating personal identity to the political dynasty, becoming, over time, more symbol than person. Jackie died in May 1994, 2 years before Carolyn married John. Her absence removed a potential mentor, someone who might have explained what the job actually required. The nearest comparison in the Kennedy record was Caroline Kennedy's 1986 wedding to Edwin Schlossberg. 400 guests, Kennedy cousins as bridesmaids, an elaborate Carolina Herrera ball gown with puff sleeves and floral appliques. That was the scale, the volume, the visual vocabulary of what it meant to marry publicly and ceremonially into the Kennedy name. Even the consultant for Carolyn's wedding planning carried the weight of that history. Letitia Baldridge, Jackie Kennedy's former White House chief of staff, was brought in to help manage the logistics. The woman who had organized state dinners for Camelot was, at least nominally, at the planning table. Whatever Carolyn did next, she was doing it in conversation with Jackie's ghost. Carolyn chose 40 guests, a candlelit church with 8 wooden pews, and a dress that began at the opposite end of every expectation. John understood the burden, at least partially. At some point during their relationship, he said, "How can I bring JFK III into this world? They'll never leave him alone." He knew. The question was whether knowing would be enough. The dress was born over cosmopolitans. Rodriguez and Carolyn Bessette met when both worked at Calvin Klein. They became close friends, and when she needed a dress, she went to the Odeon restaurant in Tribeca and asked him to make it over a drink at the bar. "It was such an exciting moment in all of our lives," Rodriguez told Vogue. In 1996, Rodriguez was head women's designer at Cerruti 1881, a Paris-based fashion house, and virtually unknown to the American public. He had real professional training, genuine skill as a cutter and tailor, but he had not yet launched his own label. He was building someone else's brand. The commission for Carolyn's dress came from personal friendship, not from a publicist, not from a brand strategy meeting, not from a celebrity alignment calculation. It was a private request from a woman to the person she trusted most, with the question of how she should look on the most photographed day of her life. His account of the design process is specific. Carolyn knew what she didn't want, something fussy, something architectural, but she resisted being pinned down. "She always had a reason to walk the dog when I brought my sketchbook over," he told The Cut. Rodriguez worked on gowns in Paris, developed ideas, adjusted. During the process, he showed the unfinished work to Azzedine Alaya. the Tunisian couturier who had essentially invented the modern bias-cut dress, who moved one seam half an inch without ever learning who the gown was for. When they finally arrived at the shape, it was Carolyn who made the decisive move. She pulled the neckline down. A dress was born, Rodriguez said. The finished gown was bias-cut pearl white silk crepe, floor length, with a softly draped cowl neckline, a skin-bearing open back, and a built-in slip. The fabric came from an Italian mill, sourced through B&J Fabrics in New York City. The dress was a French 36, an American size 6. It cost $40,000. Rodriguez later testified to Congress that millions of copies were sold at the retail level. He himself sold 40. What the dress didn't have? Beading, lace, embellishment, a full skirt, a dramatic train, volume of any kind. What it did have? A sheer silk tulle veil, long sheer gloves, crystal-beaded satin Manolo Blahnik sandals, and a hairpin at the nape of Carolyn's neck that had belonged to Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. As a something old, she wore a piece of the woman whose template she was quietly, carefully declining to replicate. The statement the dress made was radical restraint, not rejection of all tradition, but a precise reduction of it to its most essential form. The veil was present but spare. The accessories were real but minimal. The gesture was formal, but stripped of display. In 1996, bridal fashion had not yet completed its turn away from the 80s. Victoria Beckham married in 1999 in a Vera Wang ball gown with a matching purple ensemble. Celine Dion had married in 1994 in an embellished silken lace gown with an elaborate veiled headdress. Most bridal fashion of the era was, as one fashion writer summarized it, embellished, voluminous, and teeming with tulle. Vera Wang was beginning to break the mold, bringing cleaner lines to her collections, but even her work operated in a landscape that expected spectacle. Carolyn's dress was the structural opposite. Its bias cut means the fabric moves differently than any woven construction. Silk crepe clings at the hip, releases at the hem, follows the body without forcing the body into a predetermined shape. It doesn't perform a silhouette. It reveals the person wearing it. In the context of a Kennedy wedding, that choice reads as a deliberate refusal of the costume. The dress said, "I am not playing a princess. I am standing here in what I actually look like." Bridal designer Danielle Frankel, reflecting on the dress for Vogue, said, "There's something to be said for a bit of shock. It recalibrates things. It makes sense that her spirit still resonates today." Rodriguez, for his part, described the result in the simplest possible terms. "It's not the dress that you notice. Look at that photograph of her. It's her and that smile." He had felt no pressure during the design process, he said, because he was making a dress for his best friend and hadn't thought beyond that. When he came home from Cumberland Island, news trucks were parked outside his apartment. "I couldn't have imagined that it would be like that," he said, "or what it's become even today." The intimacy of the commission, a friend, not yet publicly known, making a private gift for the most private wedding he could arrange, was immediately and permanently converted into something public, global, and impossible to contain. The dress itself made that conversion irresistible. Something that looks like it costs nothing, costs $40,000 and carries the influence of Alaya in its seam placement. Something that looks effortless required multiple transatlantic trips to Paris for fittings. Those Paris trips attracted press attention of their own. Photographers spotted Carolyn dining with Rodriguez during one visit, reported that she'd split from JFK Jr., and identified Rodriguez as a mystery new man. The wedding's secrecy held even while the dress was being built in the most fashion-conscious city in the world. The secrecy wasn't an afterthought. It was the entire operating philosophy. Cumberland Island is Georgia's southernmost barrier island, 17 miles of coastline, maritime forest, and wild horses roaming free, with no bridge from the mainland, no public telephone lines, and unreliable cell service. The only way in was by private boat, small plane landing on a grass strip, or ferry from the mainland town of St. Mary's. Its daily visitor limit is 300 people. It had, in other words, the properties of a location that could only be reached by people who already knew where they were going. The couple had considered other venues, the Kennedy compound in Hyannis, Nova Scotia, but according to Once Upon a Time, Carolyn visited Cumberland Island and fell in love with it. John was drawn particularly to the First African Baptist Church, a one-room wooden chapel with 8 pews and no electricity, built in 1937 on the site of an earlier log cabin from 1893. He wanted to hold the ceremony there because when Robert F. Kennedy was shot, the island community had gathered at that church for a service in his honor. The story had moved John. The church was chosen for what it meant, not for what it looked like. Planning required what Baldridge called the skill of James Bond and the whole CIA. Guests were notified only the Tuesday before the wedding, roughly 4 to 5 days' notice. Most didn't know the destination until they were already on private planes the couple had organized. They were told they were going to Florida. Then they were told they weren't. From the mainland, they were ferried to the island's Grayfield Inn by boat. Vendors and catering staff signed confidentiality agreements. Sensitive wedding logistics were discussed in person, not on the phone, out of fear of being overheard. The event itself was referred to in all external communications as Nicole Miller's wedding. Each guest, according to accounts from the 2019 TLC documentary, JFK Jr. and Carolyn's Wedding, The Lost Tapes, received 2 rare coins as security tokens, an Indian head penny and a buffalo nickel pinned to cards they were required to carry. Guest Billy Noonan, one of John's childhood friends, was handed a camcorder and told to film. There was no elaborate videography team. There was a friend with a camera John had originally given him for his own bachelor party. The ceremony began 2 hours late. John had misplaced his shirt. Carolyn had tried to put her dress on in the car on the way to the chapel, forgetting that the form-fitting garment needed to go on before hair and makeup, not after. The neckline was tight. The dress had to be opened and reclosed by Rodriguez, a scarf placed over Carolyn's head to protect her makeup as it was pulled down over her. With no electricity, the chapel grew darker as the delay extended. Someone lit candles, and the ceremony that resulted, captured in the one photograph Carolyn chose to release, was candlelit, intimate, and 70 miles from the nearest press. Photographer Dennis Reggie, afterward, confirmed Carolyn's only instruction about what to share: show the dress. Her friend made it. Then they left the island, released one photograph, and that was the last time anything about their life was entirely on their terms. By the time they returned from their honeymoon in Turkey, reporters were staked out outside the door of their Tribeca loft. John addressed them directly on the sidewalk. Archived footage preserves what he said. "I just ask for any privacy you can give her as she makes this adjustment. That would be greatly appreciated." Photographer Larry Levine, who was in the crowd that day, recalled additional phrasing to the New York Times. Kennedy said he wasn't a private person himself. He knew what they were there for, and they would all get their photographs. But his wife was a private person, and could they please consider that? The photographers behaved that day. Then they went after whoever they were going after. The next day and the day after, the siege resumed. Carolyn told her friend Carol Radziwill, who documented it in her memoir, What Remains, that the only way to avoid the paparazzi was to leave her apartment at 7 in the morning. She told journalist Jonathan Soroff that she couldn't get a job without being accused of exploiting her fame. She had worked at Calvin Klein for years, rising to the director level, building real expertise. Now she couldn't hold a professional position without it being read as a Kennedy maneuver. She stopped working entirely after the wedding. She stopped reading tabloids in the summer of 1997. By August of that year, she was badly rattled by Princess Diana's death in Paris. chased by photographers into a tunnel, and told Rosemarie Terenzio directly that she feared they would now focus on her even more because they no longer had Diana. The documented incidents build into something that looks less like a series of bad days and more like a documented pattern of institutional intrusion. On February 25, 1996, months before the wedding, Carolyn and John were photographed and filmed having a heated argument in Washington Square Park while walking their dog. The fight centered, according to Terenzio in JFK Jr., an intimate oral biography, on him being taken advantage of by his friends. They had recently attended a friend's wedding where they were seated next to the New York Times Society editor, and Carolyn was furious that John hadn't walked out. The footage showed shouting, grabbing, what appeared to be the removal of an engagement ring. It ran in the New York Daily News and circulated internationally. John later called it a silly argument on The Howard Stern Show. It was also a private argument that had been documented without consent, published globally, and used as evidence that the relationship was already fracturing, months before they were even married. After the wedding, the documentation continued. On October 23, 1998, the couple was photographed having what tabloids called a heated argument on a Manhattan street. Law review articles in the early 2000s cited their situation as a case study in photographs obtained through harassment. A 2025 academic study in TANF Online described Carolyn as the fashion executive who was continually stalked by paparazzi before and after her marriage. The language is institutional, dry. The experience it describes isn't. George magazine ran in parallel, consuming most of John's professional attention. He had launched it in September 1995, a year before the wedding. Art director Matt Berman described Kennedy as the genuine leader of the publication, reading proofs, brainstorming covers, taking even the most junior staffers out for drinks or a baseball game. George was the thing John was really excited by. But George also needed to be fed. It needed covers, celebrity access, controversy. It needed John to be publicly John. Carolyn came to know the George staff, hung around the offices, but never held an editorial role. She wasn't in editorial meetings or photo shoots or anything, Berman told Vanity Fair. When he proposed a cover shooting John and Carolyn as American Gothic, John in overalls, Carolyn with her hair back, a Grant Wood visual, John refused flatly. "Come on, I'm not gonna whore out myself and my wife for the magazine." That refusal is telling. He understood the marriage was being solicited as content. He said no that time. The solicitation didn't stop. By 1999, George had, in one account, lost some of its initial vitality. Its circulation had dropped. The couple had been in marriage counseling since March of that year. Their last documented major public appearance together was the Newman's Own/George Awards in May 1999. People who knew them in those final months described both of them as heartbroken. The tabloids, throughout 3 years of marriage, built several distinct versions of Carolyn Bessette Kennedy. Each had very little to do with her and a great deal to do with whoever was reading. The first was the Ice Queen. Tabloids described her as cold, remote, difficult. A woman whose composure read as arrogance, whose minimalism read as contempt. The label is documented. The McGill Daily confirmed in 2026 that the tabloids called her an ice queen. Photographs from events where she was among friends show a woman laughing, unself-conscious, visibly at ease. Images that circulated alongside the Ice Queen story without displacing it. What the tabloids documented as coldness was, in most cases, a woman who had decided not to perform warmth for cameras she hadn't consented to. That's not coldness, it's a boundary. The second narrative was the social climber, the beautiful woman from Greenwich who had maneuvered her way into America's royal family. A book published during her lifetime, The Fortune Hunters, described her as a penniless adventurer pursuing the Kennedy name. That framing required ignoring a years-long professional career at one of the most demanding fashion companies in the world, built entirely before John Kennedy was part of her story. Both narratives share a structural feature. They cast Carolyn as calculating and simultaneously empty. Shrewd enough to manipulate a Kennedy, but not substantive enough to be the actual subject of any story. Carol Radziwill, in What Remains, documented the dynamic directly. Everyone wants a good story, with a prince and a princess and a villain. Carolyn, across the 3 years of the marriage, was handed the villain role, not because she earned it, but because the story needed one and she was the only new variable. The asymmetry was documented in the posthumous accounts, too. Books written after the crash, according to one analysis, assigned most marital problems to her door. Even in retrospect, Carolyn was the difficult variable. John was the golden boy, doing his best. Her own mother had seen it coming. At the rehearsal dinner on Cumberland Island the night before the wedding, Anne Messina Freeman gave a toast that is preserved in multiple accounts. The exact words? "I hope my daughter has the strength to handle all of this." Not, "I hope they're happy." Not, "I hope this is everything you dreamed." Strength, the capacity to endure. A toast that sounds, in retrospect, less like a celebration and more like a warning dressed in formal clothes, spoken in a candlelit room on a remote island by a woman who understood exactly what her daughter was stepping into. The projections didn't stop when she died. They accelerated. News coverage of the July 16, 1999 crash, a Piper Saratoga piloted by John into deteriorating conditions over the Atlantic off Martha's Vineyard, killing John, Carolyn, and her sister Lauren Bessette on the way to cousin Rory Kennedy's wedding, framed the event as a death in the American family. John was the primary subject of mourning. Carolyn's grief was processed through the prism of his story. The National Transportation Safety Board determined the cause as spatial disorientation during a night descent over water, aggravated by haze and darkness. The plane went down. Their ashes were scattered at sea from the USS Briscoe. The accounts that followed weren't always kind to her memory. One characterization from within the Kennedy family's orbit described her insecurity as fueling problematic behavior. The attribution of marital problems to her, rather than to the circumstances that surrounded them both, continued as a narrative long after she wasn't present to contest it. What remains is the record of observable choices. She chose 40 guests. She chose an island without a phone line. She chose a friend instead of a brand. She chose silk crepe instead of satin, a bias cut instead of a ball gown, a $40,000 dress that looked like nothing and meant everything. She gave no interviews. She left no written account of what any of it cost her. She left 2 audio recordings in the public record. She left 1 instruction about which photograph to share, and that instruction said, "Show the dress." Rodriguez, speaking to Vogue in 2026, described why he thought she still resonated decades later. "We live in a world that isn't real at the moment. Whether it's AI or television, nothing is what you're really seeing. And I think that there's a relief and a respite from all of it. When you see someone like Carolyn, not trapped, completely real, completely authentic, it's refreshing. It stands out even more today because it doesn't exist today." He was talking about style, but he was also describing the precise quality the Kennedy machine couldn't tolerate. The myth required performance. Carolyn refused to perform. Not entirely, not in every context, but the refusal was consistent enough to be legible. In the dress, in the 40 guests, in the 2 years of declining public appearances, in the 7 a.m. exits to avoid the cameras. The dress now turns up on bridal mood boards around the world, in the hands of women who have never heard the name Carolyn Bessette Kennedy. And that's Rodriguez's point exactly. Her influence permeates so deeply, it doesn't need to be known to be felt. Rodriguez launched his own label the year after the wedding. He won the CFDA Women's Wear Designer of the Year award twice. He designed Michelle Obama's election night dress in 2008. The slip dress Carolyn wore is credited by academic sources with redirecting bridal fashion's center of gravity away from volume and toward restraint, a shift whose downstream effects include nearly every minimalist bridal gown made in the 30 years since. Rodriguez sold 40 of his version. Millions of copies circulated. One bridal boutique displayed a cardboard cutout of John kissing Carolyn's hand to market similar dresses. A woman's most private choice became the industry's most copied template. The contradiction would have been familiar to her. Books about Carolyn Bessette Kennedy are now, one biographer acknowledges, written in an era that is much gentler on women like Carolyn Bessette Kennedy. The reassessment is genuine and ongoing. The Ice Queen and the Social Climber have largely given way to a more honest accounting. A private person placed in an impossible position, making decisions under surveillance that most people never face and can't fairly judge. The dress is the starting point for that reassessment because it's the clearest record she left. She gave no interviews, she made no speeches. What she left was a sequence of choices: 40 guests instead of 400, a one-room church on an inaccessible island, a friend working at someone else's fashion house instead of a celebrity designer, silk crepe instead of embellishment, a bias cut instead of a ball gown. And those choices, read together, constitute something like a document, not an autobiography, a posture. A woman trying to hold on to herself in a situation specifically designed to dissolve her into someone else's story. She couldn't sustain it, not because she was weak, but because the apparatus was too large and had been running too long before she arrived. Gravity doesn't negotiate. The dress was remembered because it looked effortless. The marriage was destroyed by everything that wouldn't leave them alone. Subscribe for more stories like this.